How's everybody doing today? It's Dr. Winkler again. I'm giving another lecture for History 151G, Modern Civilizations. It's getting more technical the more I go along. The simple reason that I'm having a hard time counting. Usually I'm pretty good with the digits on both hands, but sometimes 5 is about all I've got. In any event, I believe this is the 8th lecture, so we will be proceeding with our discussion of the Enlightenment. Remember last time we were discussing your friend and mine, Voltaire, his kind of contributions. Where I got that F, I don't know, so I will take it out. We are on page 7, as you can see, of your course outline. Hopefully you have that printed off, or you have another way of finding it so you can follow along and take the appropriate notes. Okay, in discussing the Enlightenment, I talked in broad terms, and I also wanted to give you a pretty good idea as to the basic assumptions. Now I want to take a little bit closer look at important people. I mentioned Voltaire, whom I think is very important, but now let's mention some other people and give you an idea as to the nature of their contributions and their ideas. There's an economic theorist in France by the name of Francois Quesnay. And he is, as I mentioned, he's an economic theorist. And what he's trying to do is to find out a way that people can have more wealth. In his discussion, in his way of thinking, wealth is in agriculture. That's a good discussion. That's a good point of departure, because we have more food, you have more people live better lives. So he says true wealth is in agriculture. The question, of course, is how can we make sure that there's as much agricultural productivity as possible? So if I can get a Francois Quesnay up here so you can enjoy looking at him rather than a blank screen. Oh, too many Francois Quesnays. In any event, I believe this is probably the most accurate. Okay, Quesnay. Quesnel. I'm getting a little bit off base. I'm not sure exactly which one is he. So I'm going to see if we can have you look at Adam Smith, whom we will be discussing in just a few minutes. What's a good portrait? We'll go with that one for the time being. Okay, Francois Quesnay, Frenchman. Economic theorist. Wealth comes from agriculture. Well, how do you increase agricultural production? Let's look at what the French crown has been doing to the agriculture of France. Of course, people like Louis XIV and Louis XV want to make sure there's as much food, in other words, as much grain as possible for the French people to eat. Even though the French people clearly have problems buying food, it's expensive. Why don't we just simply set an official price? This is the official price of grain. Therefore, people selling grain to the peasants cannot charge more than this price. One of the problems with having a set price is, does that reflect the actual amount of money, time and effort as well, going into producing the wheat? If people are selling this at such a market devaluation, then they have less incentive to grow, because they're either not making enough of a profit. In some cases, they're making virtually no profit at all. You're almost operating at a loss. How well can you run a business? What are your motivation? to produce more if you're not making more money. What actually happens in a scenario like this, we tend to see a black market. The black market, as you know, is something that's being sold someplace on the market that does not have official sanction. In other words, it is not required to sell at this certain price. You see, the price is this officially. But when you sneak around, and you can't buy enough here because not enough's being produced. So you sneak around, you get in the black market, you talk to Louis in the back, and he says, hey, for a little extra money, I'll give you a little extra grain. So actually, the price in the black market can be very high. The reason for that is it's illegal. The people that are selling it to you are running a risk. Actually, you're running a risk buying it as well. But the people selling it to you are running a risk. If the government catches you, oh boy, the punishment can be severe. So to make it worth your while, the prices you're actually paying on the black market can be very heavy. In reality, people are supposed to be buying grain at this level. But in reality, they're buying grain at a much higher price. How can you do away with this? Quesnay says, let the price float. In other words, we call this market forces. Let it find it's the exact price it ought to be. Well, what will happen if you're producing right here? The price will go up, no doubt. But when it goes up to the point where the farmer, the producer, is making a profit, now he has real incentive to produce more. So it goes up, but he has incentive to produce more. And in producing more, you have more food. The price does go down. It doesn't go down all the way to where it was before because you're not making much money at that point. So it goes up, settles up at a better price for the producer. The people down here, essentially they're paying more. But you see what this does to the black market. So rather than paying this kind of thing to augment the amount of food you really need to support your family, you do have a tendency now to be paying a little bit more, but there's more food and the black market's gone. So in reality, everybody benefits. The people producing the food benefit, and the people also buying the food benefit. This makes perfect logical sense. One of the problems with Quesnay, it's not his problem. He does talk to finance ministers. He does talk to the people in Paris who have authority in the state. This is largely under Louis XVI. Any event, they decide to try it, at least for a while. Unfortunately for his ideas, there's a factor which he cannot control, which is called the weather. In good years, you tend to have more crops. In bad years, you tend to have less crops. Initially, when his ideas were tried, it was just bad luck, literally bad luck. From the time frame, the weather was bad, so it wasn't demonstrable in any real sense that you're getting more food at a better price. However, this is one of the things, one of the issues that people in the French Revolution, starting in 1789, want to push for, a freer market where more food is available. So his ideas are pretty good. However, let's take a look now at Adam Smith. Smith plays off not just Quesnay, there are other economic theorists at the time saying that there's a better way of inducing productivity. Smith is kind of the person, he comes up with many original ideas, but he takes ideas from people like Quesnay and puts them into his theory. He wrote a book called Wealth of Nations. It's a very long title. We usually just condense it down to Wealth of Nations. I would like to tell you his nationality. There was one semester, a long time ago, I happened to be discussing Adam Smith, and I described him as an Englishman. In other words, he's from Britain. A voice in the back said he was a Scot. Okay. All right, it's me, it's on the island of Britain. You're all British anyway. No, 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 no. If you live over there, you do have an idea who is English and who is Welsh and who is Scottish. He was a Scot. He was Scottish. I don't know if that's terribly important, but it is interesting. His book, The Wealth of Nations, is very hard to read. I don't know what it was about style when he wrote the thing, but in reality, he's rather than stating things simply, like we like to do it in modern academia, particularly in the United States, in the English-speaking countries, he tries to be more challenging. Yeah, I've tried to read it. It's hard to plow through it. I never made it all the way through. The date of its publication is easy to remember. Notice we have the date, which is 1776. It's easy to remember because that happens to be the year when Edward Gibbon published his first volume on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Since we all remember that, this is an easy date to remember. I'm being silly. 1776 for Americans is symbolic not just of a nice book written by an enlightened historian, but also something about the Declaration of Independence. Well, let's look at the wealth of nations. We generally call this modern economic theory. Some people call it capitalism, market economy. Well, Quesnay is not technically wrong in saying that wealth is in agriculture. But Smith is actually saying that wealth, true wealth, that has been created where none existed before. You see, agriculture, there was always grain, and you figure out ways of having more grain. When you create wealth where none existed before, is actually manufacturing. That's where it comes in. It is the process of taking raw materials in the manufacturing process, turn them into materials or items that you want or you can use. He used the idea of the pin. Now, can we say the pin is one of your more simple manufactured items? Certainly a lot different than a clock. Well, there's several steps you go in making a pin. One of which is you get the metal, I guess you melt it. Somehow, and you have to be talented to do this, you draw the metal through holes. So now the metal is in a thinner strip. But that's not a pin. You have to take the metal, of course, at this point when it cools, and you have to get somebody to grind it down to make a pin. The big deal about this is this. He believes in having people who are really good at drawing the metal through the holes. That's what they do. That's what I do all the time. Rather than have somebody who does everything, you draw the metal through the holes and you grind the pin. The people that are really good at drawing the metal through the holes, in this case, should do that. They should do that over and over again. It can be boring, it can be very repetitive, and very importantly, you do get better at it. And the people that are really, really good at grinding the metal down into a pin, they should do that all the time. They were good anyway, but over and over and over again, you're going to have them become better and better at it. So it's a more efficient process. We call this a division of labor? Yes, we can. We find this kind of thing in the Americas as well. We remember Eli Whitney largely for the cotton gin. But Eli Whitney, an American inventor, also invented muskets with interchangeable parts. And he had, like there's several things you have to do to make a musket, one of which you have to make screws. You make them by hand. You make them by hand and you place them to hold in various configurations of the musket. The people that are really good at doing that ought to do that exclusively. The people that are really good at boring out, if it's a rifle, boring out the barrel for something like that, that is what they should do. That's more efficient. Now, but the master musket maker, he's been doing, it takes about 800 hours to make a musket. That's a lot of work. The master musket maker must be able to do all phases of manufacturing if one person is making a musket. But now you have people doing various things. This is more efficient, it's faster. But could you imagine how boring that would be? You do the same thing over and over again. However, it is more efficient as far as productivity is concerned. Smith is taking a hint, if you will, an argument from people like Quesnay. Because what Quesnay wants to do is take agriculture prices and let them float to their natural levels. So Smith says one of the best ways to have an economy is let it alone. Let the economy alone. Let the economy seek its own levels. Let the economy decide what's going to be manufactured. Using a French term for this, and you do see this in modern economic parlance even today, laissez-faire, leave it alone. If you come in like Louis XIV and XV are doing, to manipulate the economy, you will manipulate it poorly. Well, an analysis that Adam Smith uses is this. You have wheat. And what can you do with wheat? Several things, but he's really interested in talking about two. One of which is you can use it to make bread. You can grind it into flour and you bake bread. You can also malt it and make it into beer. So you have a choice, bread and beer. What do you do with it? Market forces. If people are down at the bread shop buying bread, you'll put the wheat into bread. If the guys are down, drinking the swill down at the pub at this time frame, so you'll actually take more bread, malt it into beer. See, market forces actually decide where it will go. What the consumer wants, the consumer will buy, and of course the economy will follow what the consumer wants. Another issue is what is the price of the beer or the price of the bread? Supply and demand. If the demand for the bread is high, however, the amount of bread or the amount of wheat is low, what's going to happen to the price of wheat? It's going to go up. Market forces. If the supply of wheat is small, did I say that right? Conversely, if you have less desire, people are buying less bread and more wheat, then the price will go down. Market forces, let the market decide. This is an extremely important idea. Basically, even today, we're following these basic ideas. Now, there is some problems with his success. If you have a successful market, you will compete with, let's say you're making beer. This brewing company will compete with this brewing company. The better of the two will succeed. And this one will either have to adapt, get better themselves, or go out of business. There is a possibility that under the circumstances, you have a very, very good brewing company that just simply takes the competition, trashes them. You simply can't compete. They're too good. Their marketing is too good. Their product is too good. All the things that go into having a successful company. The difficulty here is if you beat all your competition, then you have a monopoly. Monopolies are bad. The reason why monopoly is bad, wow, we're on the top of the heap right now. My goodness, we are just taking care of everybody. So what's my incentive now to be better? What's my incentive now to be more efficient? Because I have no competition. Anybody who wants beer is going to have to take the quality I give them and the amount I give them. Now, under that circumstance, you would probably see, oh, if they're kind of doing bad up here, they're not being so nice with their product, then you might have other companies show up to start competing with them. But the point is this. A monopoly is bad if you have one company controlling everything. Because even if they have a shoddy product, even if it's overpriced, somebody will buy it. So competition is actually a very good thing. He likes free markets. You want to be able to trade as efficiently and effectively as possible. If you're living in a county in England and you're making the better beer over here, And there's other people over here saying, well, it's hard to compete with that beer. So let's go to our constables here and we're going to raise the tax on impost duties. A county is quite a bad example for this. I should use nations, because usually you go to your national government and say, by the way, this imported beer is just taking me down. Do something. See, I'm in your country. Do something to protect me. And one of the things you do to protect people, of course, is to bring in, to raise imposts, to raise tariffs. Well, does that really help? If you have a free trade scenario and people say that country can beat us in this market, so protect me. Or you say, look, there are things we produce better over here. Maybe it's not beer, maybe it's bread. We do produce something better over here. So let's produce what we do good. Let's do the beer. Let's do the bread, I should say. Over here, they're better with beer. It'll work out. Our bread, their beer, it's better for everybody all around. Many years ago, back in the 80s, there was a number of agreements that the United States and other nations were entering into, dealing with free trade and looking at trade barriers, which we see between the United States and many other countries. The idea is to lower these trade barriers for more trade. Of course, protectionist people are saying, wait a minute, we don't want to have free trade with Mexico. Those people down there are really intelligent. They're really hard workers, and they'll work for a pittance compared to the kind of wages that Americans simply have to have. So we shouldn't allow this kind of trade. But the argument goes back to this. What Mexico can do better, Mexico should do better. What the United States can do better, the United States should do better. This is the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which actually lowered barriers between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. GATT, I think, was more internationally, shall we say, broader than North America, to allow free trade to exist. Of course, the debate goes on. A lot of workers in the United States say we could actually lose our jobs. Well, we want our government to protect us. During this debate, economists were asked, what is the best way to proceed? This is way back in the 80s. I think all the professors then are retired and gone on to write their books at home. I'm not sure there's one person that was in BYU economics department in the 80s is still working there. But I don't know. There might be some. In any event, some people asked the BYU economics department if these trade agreements were a good idea and asked them to sign a petition. Every person in the BYU economics department at that time signed a petition saying these free trade agreements are a good idea. Well, goes back to Adam Smith, does it not? Leave it alone. Like you take government out of what's happening. However, Smith didn't say that the government has no role at all to play, because it does. Let's go back to pins. You can imagine that the profit margin on pins would not be very high. Very simple item. You manufacture the pins where it's more efficient to manufacture them. Maybe Manchester, maybe Liverpool, maybe someplace up north in England. Where's your market? Your market would be biggest in the cities, London, for example. Well, you have to take your goods, your pins, from wherever you manufacture them to where you're going to sell them. Who's going to maintain the roads? You've got to have roads, you've got to have canals, you've got to have means of transportation. Your little pin factory couldn't possibly afford to do that and transport pins as well. You can't do that. Are there brigands? Yeah, fortunately, people like to break the law. People like to steal things. And if you're bringing something that they consider being of some value, and there's not sufficient police protection, can you really hire enough macho guys to protect your pins and still make a profit? You see, as far as laws and protection are concerned, the government has to do that. And as far as maintaining infrastructure, including roads and canals, the government has to do that as well. To another extent, isn't it better to have an educated workforce? If you have somebody, and uneducated people are very intelligent, but if you're trying to teach them new skills, they are at a certain disadvantage. Let's say you want to teach people how to make better pens. And so you write up a little instruction manual. You can tell them, but it's easy to have people remember and refer to this little manual. What if you can't read? Here's the instruction manual. Read it and we'll discuss it. And you go, I can't read. Can you possibly, as a pen manufacturer, afford to build schools for children so you have an intelligent workforce? No, you can't afford to do that, but maybe the government can. So the government is left out in this theory as far as actually how the economy functions. But it does have a role to play in making the scenarios in which the economy can function well. I should mention international protection. If your enemy invades, the armies come sweeping through your pen factory, grabbing everything they want. Got another problem. But if the government can protect you, also militarily, that is much to your advantage. A possible downside to these basic theories is that where does the worker stand? The worker is actually, I want to call him or her, commodity is the wrong word, but kind of something that can be manipulated. There's no statement in here that you have to look after your workers' interests, that you have to pay them a fair wage. The idea being is, if they're more productive and they make more pens and you pay them per pen, you might make a little more money. But the jobs are boring and there's really nothing you can do in this scenario. Remember, you've got to keep prices down because you're competing. So you keep the cost of labor down. There's nothing really protecting them. There's no such thing as old age pension or health care. There's nothing like those kinds of things, or even necessarily a fair wage. When we see people reacting to this, particularly when Europe is industrializing in a very real sense in the 19th century, you find a lot of workers that are upset. We're just a thing. We can be abused. We can be discarded. We can be fired. Our wages are low and our conditions are poor. And you do see these kind of people becoming quite concerned. They try to organize. We get socialist groups who don't really like capitalism at all. Coming back and focusing much on Adam Smith, the date of this publication is highly significant because England, and in a few decades later, you're going to see nations of Europe industrializing. In other words, using the manufacturing process, machines to produce more goods, and eventually machines that make parts to make other machines. And this is a very helpful theory to push for industrialization because it's a very strong argument that capitalism does work. All right, Adam Smith, very important. Let's look at somebody else, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He is a very interesting person because he is stunningly original. A lot of people kind of go with the flow. I have this basic idea. How do I make my contribution? Well, I take the basic ideas and I kind of elaborate or tangentially go in different directions. Rousseau is different. Sometimes there's these basic assumptions that a lot of Enlightenment thinkers have. And what they do is he goes, in some cases, quite opposite directions. Okay, he's Swiss. If you're Swiss, I'm Swiss. If you're Swiss, you like Swiss. He's French-speaking Swiss. He's from Geneva. Heavily abused child. In fact, when he was born, his mother died. And a kindly aunt nursed him. There's no such thing as baby formula back then. A kindly aunt nursed him and allowed him to survive. Rousseau said later on, I finally found it within my heart to forgive her because his father was a very brutal man who severely abused him. Well, Rousseau takes jobs that are menial. He has education. He can certainly read and write. And actually what he does for a long time when he's making a living is to copy items. I mean, at this time frame, there are very few, there's no such thing as a photocopy machine. There's no such thing as a mimeograph machine. There's no way to duplicate records, but you do have to have copies. So you pay somebody, it's usually paid by the page, a small coin per page to copy something. As historians, back in the time frame before copying was so readily available, this is a good century before the invention of the typewriter, which makes writing more efficient. And when you have a key that strikes the piece of paper, you can read the key. You make money by copying these things rapidly. As historians, and some historians are better at this than others, you go back and look at these documents, you go, oh my God. Right as fast as you can. Okay, let's see if we can figure out really what the word is, because sometimes the handwriting can be quite challenging. He's married. He's living very strongly in poverty. Do we need to get Rousseau up here? In fact, his poverty is so, let's go here. His poverty is so extensive, right word? He's so poor that there are times when kindly people, there's a kindly woman, for example, who gives him money. So he has the opportunity to survive. Well, there's an essay contest in Paris. We see this in Enlightenment. This is not unusual. And the essay contest dealing with how do the arts and sciences influence morality? Now, if you had Voltaire enter this, we have a pretty good idea what Voltaire would say. Well, the arts and sciences really enhance the humanity, make you a better person. Remember, Rousseau is the person who's quite original. In his Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, published, as you can see, let's get our marker up here, in 1750, where he argues something very different. He argues the arts and sciences don't make you better people. What does make you a better person, is your moral sense, your moral sensibility, which is also called your conscience. This is how you elevate yourself, your conscience. That's within your mentality, makes you a better person. Well, why don't the arts and sciences do this? Let's look at them a little bit. One of your broader art forms happens to be theater. Why would I say that? Theater actually involves more than one art form. Theater involves literature, poetry, the spoken word, the presentation. It even has something to do with clothing, costumes. It even has something to do with painting. You have to have a set behind you. Can we say of all the arts, it brings more together? We could probably say that. Does going to the theater make you a more moral person? In certain areas, I'm not saying in every area, but certain areas, the theater has a bad reputation in France and other countries at this time frame as being immoral. One of the reasons for this is that sometimes the theater owners would allow young women, shall we call them women of the night, to come in for free. So they come in, have their seating section, whatever. So young men will pay money. They will pay admittance fees. And they will come in, they might listen to the play as well. But they'll also look over at these young ladies and say, she looks like a pretty good bet. I want to have a night with her. That's bad reputation. What kind of people are actors and actresses? I'm not going to say there aren't moral and upright actors and actresses. But I am going to say that they do have a tendency to have a bad reputation. Sleep around a lot, interchangeable morality. Are these moral people? If the theater makes you moral, should it not be that the people that are most closely associated with it, the actors, the producers, the writers, should they not be people above, shall I say, beyond reproach? These are people that are really moral. And Rousseau, and we kind of do this same thing today. We look at these people and going, oh my goodness, what kind of people are you? So we can make an argument that maybe, at least in that direction, it doesn't help. Have you seen this kind of thing? I'm a theater buff. I like to go to the theater. I often get season tickets. I enjoy it. I like concerts. I like free concerts are my favorite, but yeah, pay a little bit and get a good concert. I like that as well. I go to the theater and I see a good play, a musical, drama. I like them all. I get into this. This is very interesting. I go to a concert, and if it's a good concert and I happen to enjoy that genre of music, I will feel very good about myself. But I've never had the urge, like when I leave a concert or a play. Well, now I'm inspired. I'm going to go down to the mission. I'm going to start donating labor. I'm going to go to the food bank. And what I think I'm seeing is other people aren't doing that as well. Is it making me a better person? In defense of theater, I will say this, that a lot of times, if you have a very good drama, they will bring out issues that make me think. And sometimes when they make me think, I might think things better and come up with better conclusions. And maybe at times I'll even come out and say, maybe my morality ought to be a little better. One just popped in my mind. I have never read the book Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. It's huge. I've started, don't get anywhere. He buries me in detail. But I have seen the play enacted a couple, 3 times. And I've also seen the motion picture. There are several versions. I've seen different versions. Can we say the discussion here is literally about sin and redemption? And I do look at situations like this that are enacted within the play where it says, oh, I should forgive other people. See, there's a message there that I can take. Has that made me a better person? I would like to think it has. So Rousseau is not always completely right in this sense. But can we say that which inspires us to be better people from the arts and sciences tend to be quite narrow? Science, you seek for truth. Science this time frame is not exactly like we were discussing in scientific revolution. We're not deciding if Saturn has ears or not. But people tend to think of the sciences in terms of seeking truth. So it's a little bit more like philosophy. Rousseau says, why are you seeking for truth? How would you know truth if you saw it? Well, you would think, well, it makes sense. Well, a lot of things make sense. I mean, does it look different? Does it act different? Does it think different? He's saying that a lot of times looking for truth in science, truth in philosophy, is an effort in frustration. You're not going to go anywhere with it. Now, once again, I would come back and say there's such things as moral philosophy that do have a tendency, I think, to bring out issues and make me a better person. However, he is right in some respects, is he not? That sometimes these efforts are really not fertile and really not helpful. Do you think that he won this essay contest? His originality really knocked people over. And yes, he did win the essay contest. It's a think piece. It's very interesting. He comes up with the concept of the ideal society. This is the social contract. He's from Switzerland. He's from Geneva. He knows about small communities in Switzerland. Switzerland's very admirable in a lot of respects, one of which is they do have a tendency to live in small communities. You do see communities with a lot of rights, and sometimes they choose their leaders by a vote, by democracy, which is very unusual for this time frame. That's the kind of thing, shall we say, taking it in a small area that Rousseau wants to have expanded into a larger area, like rather than a village or a small town, into a state. People should live in small communities within the state. And a person should feel morally obligated to follow the laws of that state because unfortunately, we're not talking women yet. but he has contributed to the making of the laws. Therefore, that person has a vested interest in keeping the laws. We have a more moral society because people participate. That sounds very good in theory. It's an interesting read. But the point I'm trying to make is there's kind of a catch. What do you do? Go over here, use force. What do you do to a person who does not cooperate, who doesn't really get on board? You can use force. You can compel that person to conform to the norms of the society. I remember reading this. I read the whole thing. It's interesting. I must have read right through this. There's a paragraph or two, page or two. And then I was reading critiques of him later on. They're saying, oh, this guy, the big proponent of force. I'm going, well. So I went back. Yes, he does say something like this. Some people have wanted to use Rousseau in a very negative sense. And let's go to Cambodia in the 1970s. There was a regime called Pol Pot. And he was a pretty awful man. He was a communist dictator in Cambodia. When he came to power in Cambodia, there's like 8 million people in Cambodia. He doesn't like the upper classes. He doesn't like the intellectuals. He doesn't like the educators, so he has them killed. Oh, they worked to death in the fields. After a few years of Pol Pot's regime, we say the population of Cambodia went from 8 million to about 6 million. That's a huge loss of life, huge loss of suffering. But what would he use for justification for this? Dictators have been doing awful things for a very lengthy period of time. But one author I read was saying this, that remember, Cambodia and many other nations as well were part of the French Empire. So the intellectuals that later end up understanding French law, where the French end up giving them authority in the state, are educated in France. And they know French, of course, and they've read the social contract, where they are justifying the use of force. Are we really going to blame, seriously, are we really going to blame Rousseau for Pol Pot? I think that's a very large extension. However, I think I mentioned this already in another context. When I was in East Germany before the collapse of the Iron Curtain back in 1983, I traded money on the black market. I got all this money and there is nothing to buy. There's really no consumer goods. Well, I always want to buy a book. There are bookstores. So I buy some books. Books that I kind of wanted, never having gone around to reading them. But I did go to a kiosk where you buy gum and magazines. Actually, the Europeans don't really eat gum. You buy candies, chocolates, and magazines. The magazine was a dictionary of communism. Obviously, East Germany is a communist state. And it was easy German, so I read it fairly rapidly. And it does get to a section where it states that you can use force. You have an ideal society, like East Germany, communist society. If people do not conform, you can use force. And I remember reading that going, where's Rousseau again? They don't quote Rousseau, but I'm saying he shows up in various places. I'm really not going to blame Rousseau for Pol Pot. And I'm not going to blame Rousseau for communist East Germany. But it is interesting that his ideas can be, shall we say, exaggerated or even twisted to be used as a justification for brutality. One of his most important works is, well, it's a novel. It's not a novel in the sense we have boys and girls meeting each other. Can we say it's a running essay that in reality brings in various elements? We do have conversations in it, so it's somewhat novelized, not just an essay. And this is Emile, published, you can see, about the same year as The Social Contract, 1762. Notice this original thinker. In this, he's making an argument, and actually, let me clarify this. His novel, his work, Emile, is really an attempt to show how you should raise children. Have we seen this before? Wow. No, really. Really, we have not. And he says that childhood is not bad, it's good. Coming from the intellectual traditions in Europe, if you're Catholic, you have a tendency to believe that children are born into sin. You just come in as a sinful nature. If you're Protestant, you have a tendency to believe that children come in and can't choose to be good anyway. That's chosen for them. So how do you control children? You're mean to them. You beat them. Conventional wisdom says that you beat people, you beat children to have them conform to what you want them to be. Now, from our standpoint, modern psychiatry and sociology say that's probably not a good idea, because people that have been treated with cruelty will be cruel. And maybe this goes to a certain extent helping us understand the brutal nature of the society this time frame. But Rousseau comes now and says childhood is good. It's not bad. Give the child freedom to explore. You don't want to control. Give them freedom to explore. Let them run around. Let them wear loose clothing that's comfortable. What people very often would do was take children. This is before you really have clothing made for children. You dress them like adults. You got a little boy, you got a little girl. They dress the same way adults do. It might be acceptable for a guy to wear trousers that's too tight, or women to wear clothing that's too form-fitting. That might be acceptable. But have children? No, let them have loose clothing. Let them play around. The laughter and play of children is not deplorable. It's delightful. Give them freedom. But you do need to teach them things. And one of the ways you teach them things, the best way, is by example. If you have a child, you want the child to be honest yourself. If you're teaching in the modern world that child to drive, and you want that child to stop at stop signs, when you're driving, maybe you should stop at stop signs as well. Is this true? Is this the best way to teach? I tend to think so. Children like to copy their parents. They like to copy people that have authority over them. That's how you learn how to act. You just look and see what your dad or mother does, and you do exactly the same thing. If that person is good, honest, and has, shall we say, good character, it's much more likely the child will pick up on that. He does make an emphasis here, and that is better for people to nurse their own children. You see, if you're a highborn lady and you have a child, it ties you down for months, sometimes many months, to nurse that child. That's the only way you can feed it. It takes a while to wean them, and you got to get them on solid food. You're all familiar with this kind of thing. If you're a highborn lady, why don't you just hire somebody to do it? You don't have to worry about it yourself. You have to get up with a crying baby in the night. So you hire what we call a wet nurse, a woman who has had a child herself, so she's in a position to nurse children. You pay that woman, of course, a certain amount of money. Only poor women, of course, would look upon this as a means of employment. This has to be exaggeration. At least I hope it is. That there were times that some of these wet nurses were trying to nurse up to 10 children at one time. Now, I have to believe that's an impossibility. But the idea is this: should you not take more care of your own children? Would it not be better for you to take care of your own child, nurse the child yourself? You'll treat the child better. The child will get the nourishment that it needs. We can't prove this, but we do read that women in this time frame took this, at least some of them took this to heart. And in doing so, they started nursing their children again. You need to educate a child. We're still on a meal. You need to educate a child in certain things, including a religion. Now, he said you don't introduce a child to religion until he or she's like 12 years of age. Well, some people, I think, in the modern world would say that's a little bit late. In any event, you wait until the child's old enough to understand better. And in a section in this book, it's the Creed of the Savoyard priest. In the Creed of the Savoyard priest, you have the priest talking about, shall we say, his idea of religion. Now, I'm going to say that maybe this priest hasn't really studied his doctrine as thoroughly as maybe the church would like him to do. But Rousseau has him say things like this. Rather than going to an intellectual proof of religion, rather than like the deists and Voltaire, going into an intellectual proof that either there is no God or God doesn't care about us, the Savoyard priest says, can you not feel feelings? Can you not feel? Do you not know in your heart that there is a God? And do you not know from your feelings that there's a function of right and wrong? Going back to, shall we say, his basic ideas of conscience. He's revisiting that idea. A lot of people, even today, say, I'm not sure about your intellectual arguments. And some people say, for whatever reason, you believe this, you don't believe this. But a lot of people are saying, the reason why I believe in a God is simply because I feel that there's a God. We come up with what sometimes is called religion is a good bet. Rousseau doesn't invent this idea, but can we say he popularizes it more than it had been before. Let's be hypothetical. Let's say that there is no God, there is no religion, there is no right and wrong. But you lead a moral life, as though there is. Now, if there is no God, and you lead a moral life, you don't get any reward, aside from the fact that you led a good life. What if there is a God? What if there is right and wrong? And then you lead a good moral life. Then you've won everything. You've won salvation. So in either case, it's what we call it the good bet. There is a God, it's still good to be moral. If there's not a God, there is a God, you should be moral. If there's not a God, be moral anyway. It's almost like a win-win situation. We have an interesting man, but in reading his autobiography and other works, this man is awfully paranoid. Everybody's out to get him. He sponges off of people. This is commonly done. Voltaire is one of the best sponges of his generation. He's going over and living with princes, and in case the king of Prussia happens to be Frederick the Great, he's over there talking intellectual ideas and literally eating all the food and wearing all the clothes presented to them. It was fashionable on certain levels of society, if you're wealthy, to have a Enlightenment thinker in your household, because you can talk a lot. Rousseau says all these slights and people that are said things, and he doesn't really say what they are, but the guy's paranoid. But let's call him one of the great hypocrites, intellectual hypocrites of his age. Remember, he's arguing that childhood is good. He's married, he has children. We believe it was something like 5 children that he had. Well, he's poor when he's having children, when his wife's having children. She begs him to keep them. He says, we can't afford these kids, so he gives them away. He gives them away to foundling asylums. We also call them orphanages. Foundling asylums are not well financed. If it's a foundling asylum that the church is running, the church has, very rarely does the church have enough money. So these kids have a tendency to have a little less good clothing, a little less good food. It's expensive to educate them, so rarely are they educated. If the foundling asylum orphanage actually is in the state, a state orphanage, which is a little more rare, but they are there. The state is embarrassed by these kids because usually they're the fruit of, you technically call them orphans, but usually their family is either too poor or they're illegitimate. And the stigma on illegitimacy sometimes was so strong that a woman who has a child out of wedlock couldn't possibly dream of keeping it. So it's an embarrassment to the state, and you don't want to take taxation to pay for this. So once again, they're underfunded. Under these circumstances, you could well imagine that survival to adulthood is probably even more challenging than survival to adulthood in other aspects of society. You see, infant mortality rates or child mortality rates are very high, even in the highest levels of society. If you do survive into adulthood, you have no family, you really have no education. How do you survive? Well, if you're a boy, you can go out and become involved in theft. If you're a girl, prostitution. What are your options? They are very limited. To take your children and put them in the foundling asylum was a pretty awful thing to do. When it was discovered that Rousseau had done this, some of the people who found out about this tried to go to the foundling asylums and tried to go there and, shall we say, rescue the children, but the records were unclear. They couldn't find them. So we don't know what happened to them. In all likelihood, their fate was very negative. It was very challenging. Of course, Rousseau was asked, why did you raise your children? You were the guy who believed in the goodness of childhood. And he says, oh, well, I was poor at the time. And, if I had chose to raise my children, I would have done a good job. But I just simply couldn't afford it. Going back to his early poverty, when he's having a hard time making ends meet, essentially before his career started taking off after 1750. I mentioned there was a woman who gave him money, slipped him some coin, made it more likely for him to survive. Later in her life, she ran across hard times. She had some physical problems. In fact, she finally became an invalid. She got to the point where she couldn't use her legs. And she's sunk into deep poverty. She wrote to Rousseau numerous times saying, Rousseau, I helped you when you needed it. I need your help now. Not only did he not respond to these letters, he never sent her a small coin. He never sent her a centime. How could he be that cruel when he did have money? Rousseau's an interesting man, but he's a hard man to like. Let's start talking about changes. We talked about economic theory. Let's talk a little bit more about economic, shall we say economic fact? Let's look at the agricultural revolution. Let's see what's happening in the agricultural sector, where we now have agricultural yields that go very, very high. Can we say that in reality, what's typical in almost every place in Europe before the agricultural revolution is low yields? By our standards, very low yields. In fact, in some acres, let's look at France. France is a very good agriculture nation, as I'm sure most of you are aware. On the same acre today, the same acre of land growing wheat, we can grow sometimes 4 or even 5 times as much wheat on that same acre today as they were at this time frame. Whoa, big, big change in agricultural productivity. So by our standards, you're producing low yields. Crop failure. This haunts Europe. One study I read indicated that on the average, in one section, let's pick on France, let's pick on England, for example, other countries, that every 8 or 9 years, on the average, it might come more often, it might be not as often, but on average, you're going to have a crop failure, a major crop failure every 8 or 9 years. What do you do if you have crop failure here? Well, a lot of times there is crops other places. If you can afford to buy it and get it transported, you can keep on going on. But we can say crop failure is something that really does haunt a lot of people. Usually it's dealing with weather, sometimes insects. As we examine human remains from this time from and earlier, we do see that people on the average are shorter than they are today. One of the major reasons for that is nutrition. Well, look at growth bones on people, their leg bones. It is not uncommon as we examine human remains that just have a bone, let's call this a leg bone rather than an arm bone, that you'll see little marks in here that are dark because this was a time when the child was growing, that he or she did not have proper nutrition. When you don't have proper nutrition, you're not going to grow as well. People do have a tendency to be shorter. In some cases, several inches shorter than they are in the modern world. That's because of crop failures. They're using a system, most places in Europe, called the three-field system of crop rotation. Let's see if I can give you an example. Oh, I guess this works. Okay, you got three-field system. You rotate the crops, crop rotation. Over here you have wheat or rye, and some wheat and rye. That's why you make your bread. Over here, sometimes you have oats, but usually you have what we call legumes. Legumes is a big word, which really means peas and beans. Over here you have fallow. Why do you have fallow? Because these kinds of crops, here and here, particularly wheat, has a tendency to denigrate or lessen the fertility of the soil. If you don't do something to rebuild the fertility of the soil and you're growing wheat, it doesn't take too long. In fact, just a few years, and you will see a less productivity on that acre. That's why you have to rotate. Do you see what's happening here? The agricultural revolution, a much better productivity in crops, tends to come up to the idea of fallow. If you have fallow and you can do away with that, a more advanced crop rotation, then you are now increasing your acres on your farm by 50%, which means that you can produce a lot more food. So can we say the revolution is based on fallow ground, which really comes from better crop rotation? Agriculturalists experiment with rotation, various kinds of crops. It gets so elaborate at times. I'm not saying this is common, but it gets so elaborate at times that sometimes the rotation is like an 8, 9, or even 10 different crop rotation. Of course, you got to take very, very good care that you're doing this the right way, because that can be complicated over the years. Most of it's more simple, but can we say basically what you're doing is introducing new crops that help keep the fertility up, crops that you can use. Well, we talked about legumes, peas and beans, turnips. Turnips are helpful. The difficulty with turnips is there's not an awful lot of calories in turnips. Yeah, as people, you and I can eat turnips. Usually you do this in time of famine. But usually when you're growing turnips, you're growing them to feed animals. You feed your livestock with turnips. But if you're using the land to feed livestock, you're using the land to give you meat. So turnips help. Potatoes, we talked about the virtue of the potato earlier in this class. Is it better in some respects? Sure it is. In fact, in some areas, Ireland, Germany, Britain, for example, the potato does have a tendency to push back wheat production. Potatoes are very good people food. Clovers, well, clovers and grasses. Once again, you don't eat clover. We don't eat grass. It simply cannot digest it. But stock can. Cows can. So turnips, people eat them as well. But clovers and grasses, some of them do have a tendency to keep the fertility of the soil high. In fact, some of them, like alfalfa, do have a tendency to put as much, if not more, nutrition back into the soil than it's taking out. So you can use alfalfa to feed your cattle. You have more meat, and it actually enhances the fertility of the soil. Once you realize this, this can have large implications on productivity, food, and then population. Also, health and longevity of people in your society. Who would you think would lead out in this kind of thing? Well, the Dutch. Remember, they have a very, very interesting area. Holland is an area that during the Middle Ages, at least half of modern Holland, was probably underwater. It took churchmen, usually monks, that looked out at the outer shore and saw these, what do you call those? That's where they have the dikes, the polders today, sandbars. And they realize there's a level of those out there. It's kind of a ring of them. And if you connect those with dikes, polders, connect those with dikes, then the sea will no longer come in on the land. You've got to pump the water off the land. You do that largely with windmills. Well, now you have the bottom of the sea right there. Well, you really can't farm the bottom of the sea, at least not yet. Over a lengthy period of time, you can plant certain kinds of grasses that can live in the salt soil down there. After a while, you can use other kinds of grasses in there, and they tend to take out the salinity. So after a while, you can now literally farm what used to be the bottom of the sea. And even today, we tend to see that on per acre yield, the Dutch have very often the highest, if not one of the highest, per acre yields of crops anywhere in Europe, or necessarily maybe anywhere in the world. They have been involved in agriculture and improving agriculture for a very lengthy period of time. So we would actually believe that maybe this is a good place to lead out. That's true. The agricultural craze. It's like the scientific revolution, the Copernican revolution. You come up with somebody with a good idea, and everybody says, well, I can hop on that and do better. So you get the idea that experimenting with crop rotation is better. Then everybody wants to experiment, and it works. So the agricultural craze, experimentation. Horses and machines. How do you plow a field? Well, oxen, let's be honest, a lot of times when you're plowing the field, you're actually putting a strap on your husband, and he's kind of pulling this thing along. Now, that's a pretty poor outfit. That does happen. Oxen aren't terribly expensive. Oxen are bulls that have been fixed. They're a large animal. They're a powerful animal. You can harness them to pull your plow. If you look at the raw strength of an ox versus the raw strength of a horse, the ox is just as strong as a horse is. But why would I say going horses, therefore, is a better direction? Well, the ox and the horse are about the same strength. The horse is faster. If you're using horses to plow your field, very often they will plow twice as much land as will an ox. And we're using machinery, better machinery for planting and later harvesting. Something we call enclosure. Let's talk about enclosure in this case in England. England is a wealthy country for a number of reasons, commerce, trade being among them. But the English, particularly during an earlier time frame, later Middle Ages, into the Renaissance, they're making a lot of money on wool. Clothing back then was wool. This cotton thread, that comes later. We'll talk about that when we get to the Industrial Revolution. So you have sheep, and you take sheep and you shear the sheep, and you send them down to Belgium, and they weave the sheep into cloth, and they dye the sheep. They dye the wool. Okay, you dye the. Let me start over again with this. I'm getting lost. You start out, you shear the sheep in England. You send the wool down to Belgium. They take the wool, they weave it into cloth. We later call these blankets. You weave them into cloth, you dye the wool. And this makes a lot of money for both the English and for the Belgians and Dutch. Later on, the English get thinking, well, why should we send it down there? We can weave the cloth up here. So England makes money in weaving cloth up there as well. But let's say you own land in England, and you want to make as much money as you can. You can get your peasants out there and you have them work, and they can grow grain and food. And yeah, that's very helpful. Well, how about just kick those people off? Just get rid of them. Get rid of these kids or families, and we'll bring on sheep. Sometimes sheep are called golden hooved sheep because you make so much money by using sheep on the land. This can be devastating when you come in and take farmers, and sometimes these people have been there for generations, and you come in and say, you're gone. We're getting rid of you. Now, you're going to hire a certain percentage of them back. You do have to have people to oversee the dogs, and the dogs take care of the sheep. You do have to have people that shear the sheep. You have to do things like clip the sheep's tail in the spring. There are ways that you do take and use people to work, but you hire some people back, but not usually as many as you let go. But see, what enclosure does is actually creates more money for the landlord. When you've got more money, you've got more money to invest. And so enclosure, in the case of England, does have a tendency to have more money available for the people, for the moneyed men who can invest more in machinery and in horses. But there is a percentage of people that are left out on this. What happens to them? Well, they're poor. They tend to go into cities where you can beg more or get more charity. Now they're available for industrialization. They are available as a highly motivated workforce to go into your factories. As we look at places like England, we tend to see the poorer areas are the ones where we have less enclosure. And the richer areas are the ones where enclosure is more advanced. I want to mention somebody by the name of Jethro Tull. Yeah, I don't know how popular of a singer Jethro Tull is anymore. There's a modern singer by the name of Jethro Tull. And Jethro Tull sings country and western songs. I'm not talking about him. Obviously, look at the dates. It's very, very different. He's an Englishman. He spends time down in Holland. And he observes what's happening in Holland and says, wow, let's do this in England. It's a very good idea. He emphasizes horses and machines. How do we use machines in agriculture? Remember, still a very large percentage of your food actually comes from wheat, what you actually eat, your bread. How do you sow the grain? Well, Dad goes out and plows up the field, and then you get the rakes and you break up the soil so the seed will go into it more easily. You can rake the seed in. And you've got Mom right there, and Mom has a basket full of grain, and she goes like this. She's sowing the field. No matter how good you are at this, no matter how skilled you are at this, some of the kernels will land farther apart than necessary. And some, unfortunately, will also land too close. So the plant is kind of in competition with each other, and they don't grow as well. Of course, what's behind back there? Your little daughter, sometimes your little boy, with a stick. Why on earth would you have to have a stick behind you? Yeah, Dad's going to be raking this grain into the ground as fast as he can. But you're also going to have a child there. And they're going to whack around to keep the birds away. The birds are up there going, dinner time. If the birds come down and start grabbing your grain, you're going to have a lower yield. And you get a little boy, a little girl, and sometimes they're pretty good at it, sometimes they're not. But you can see the problems involved in this kind of agriculture. If you have a machine, and essentially what they have is a machine. You simply have a hopper, if you will. You dump all the grain in here. You have small tubes going into the ground. And you drag that through the ground, largely an inch or two beneath the actual surface of the ground. When Dad's raking the grain into the ground, sometimes it might be too shallow, sometimes it might be too deep. But this will put it exactly the right depth. And also, there's a little screw in there, and it'll put the seed out at a very regular basis. The next time you go to a wheat field that's been formally planted, just do this. Just go down and just push the wheat aside, and you'll see that the wheat is actually in rows. Actually in rows, spaced almost perfectly apart. This is machinery. This is going to make sure that you're going to have more grain by the use of machinery. And I've already mentioned horses. Experimentation going on. A lot of things are happening. Let's look at England. Yes, the per acre yields in Holland are very high, but the per acre yields in England are also very high. It's very, very, very good agriculture. France has very good yields per acre as well. But let's see if we can actually put a number on how much more productivity. Let's look at England. From 1870, I can't read. How about from 1700 to 1870? You have the agricultural revolution. And we see that in this period of time, what's that? This well over a century and a half, that we find yields, productivity in an agriculture sector are 300% more productive than had been the case before. You've literally tripled the output of your land. That's a remarkable accomplishment. Now we could say, well, okay, if you have 300% more productivity and you have a very large percentage, like 400% more workers on the land, you say we haven't really accomplished anything. So the 300% more productive actually comes when you only have like 14% more farmers. Whoa. So this 300% increase is really dealing with a small percentage of increase in farmers. In fact, you almost have the exact same number. Obviously, this is tremendous. Well, we see a population increase. We can call this a population explosion. Why do you have a population increase? Well, in actuality, you have decline in the death rate. Before this time frame, you have the birth rate, which tends to keep population high. Excuse me. Death rate, more births, a lot of people out here. But when the death rates are high, the population is growing. It's not like the death rates, at times this happens, but usually it does not. The death rate does not exceed the birth rate. High birth rate, high death rate. Population is growing, but shall we say, relatively slowly right here. If you can decrease the death rate, if you can decrease the death rate and the birth rate remains high, then you see what happens. Now you have a lot more people. If you have, and one of the ways you do this, of course, is agriculture. Let me take a look at other factors involved. The biggest single disease that inhibits population in Europe is the Black Death. Now, I already mentioned in another context that smallpox around smallpox a killer. Of course, there's going to be hygiene problems. Hygiene is going to lead to death rates. We're also going to see nutrition. But usually when you have more food, you have more nutrition. So that does help us understand that agriculture is helping very, very strongly in this area. But the Black Death, for whatever reason, goes. It came in the 1300s. We usually read about the very, very first introduction of Black Death in a few small areas, Italy and southern France, in 1347. But in 1348 and 1349, it literally sweeps up through Central and Western Europe. It's devastating. Roughly a third of all the people in Europe die. One of the most devastating aspects, of course, that loss is horrific. But as you look at this, it doesn't leave. For a very lengthy period of time, it comes back almost every 20 years in a major outbreak. But for whatever reason, almost every summer, particularly in the cities, sometimes in the countryside, you do have a tendency to see the Black Death come again. People aren't sure what it is. Some people say it's spread by the air. You can clean your air by having fires around you. It burns the air. I mean, they don't know what to do. But the Black Death starts to decline in ferocity. Can I throw a little caveat here? Let's go all the way back to the Reformation. To properly understand what's happening in the Reformation and other time frames, we do have to remember the Black Death is still here. Death is around the corner. You'll get this, you can die in a few days. If you have the pulmonary kind, which you breathe in, you can die in a matter of hours. It can literally kill you that fast. Death is at the door. And maybe one of the reasons why the Reformation wants to get religion right, to make sure your soul is in the proper perspective before you go in the next life, because you can go at any time. Why does the Black Death go? We're not sure. We have some theories. One theory is, let's go to England. The Great Fire of London, there's a Black Death outbreak in like 1665 in London. And it spreads to the countryside, for example, and go, oh my goodness, people are dying. And then there's the Great Fire of London in 1666. It sweeps, 4/5 of the city is burned. It sweeps through the old buildings downtown, the old places where we would believe would really be breeding grounds for vermin, for rats, for insects. It burns them out. Of course, you've got to rebuild London. In doing so, apparently, whatever was brought the Black Death is gone. We really do not read about another major outbreak, I'll say it right, outbreak of the plague in London and in other places of England. Did the fire cause this? Maybe it did. But you're not burning all of Europe, and the Black Death is in many other countries as well. One theory is that people start using their houses differently. There is something which they call thatch. Maybe I can show you what thatch is easier than I can explain it. Okay. What you do, and this is the wrong, thatch for roofing, and I will try that and then it'll go. See, what you do is you take grass, what you're doing, and you weave it. And you weave it in a certain manner to make it so the water won't seep in. The water, of course, since the roof is sloped, will slope off. The water will fall off. Now, one of the problems with this is over time, these are just weeds, literally, and what they will do is actually kind of rot. So you have to do this every few years, but it is quite good as far as bringing warmth in. However, back then, before you have a real easy way of controlling insects, you could imagine that insects could live up here very easily. And maybe in your house, the insects are falling down and bringing plague with them, possibly. But then when the shifts, we start using slate, which is stone, and different kinds of roofing, where you don't have, using thatch is common, that you probably have a little less disease, possibly. Another issue is that you have a change in rat population. The brown rat's been around for centuries. The brown rat tends to like people. By that, the brown rat is the kind of rat that runs in your house and everybody's screaming because it might hop across the baby, and you might try to whack that thing down. That rat tends to live in more proximity with people. However, the black rat, I think that the technical term is Rattus rattus. The black rat actually starts pushing out the brown rat. Now, the brown rat is kind of a wimp rat compared to the black rat. The black rat is macho rat. This, rather than in running across the baby crib in your living room, this rat's out in the backyard beating up the cat because he's a mean rat. He's a ferocious rat. He doesn't live as close to people. Does that mean in pushing the brown rat out, you got a black rat, the rats are no longer as close to people, therefore he doesn't bring plague? The bottom line is we really don't have a good explanation. Maybe it's several things, maybe it's a number of factors. The last major outbreak of the plague in France was like 1711. It pops up from various places at time to time. It still does that. We still run across it in places like India. We still run across it in places like the American Southwest where a rodent bites a kid and gives them a Black Death. Since it's a bacterium, we can use antibiotics to fight it nowadays. But the Black Death's gone. We don't know why, but it's gone. Other things that tend to control population, famines, epidemics. Famines, well, agriculture, going back to better agriculture, fewer famines. That moderates, so you're going to have more food. You got more people. Epidemics. Smallpox, remember, is still a major killer. This probably started in China. And it actually ended up being in I should said that wrong, in Turkey. What's her name? Montague. There's a lady there who noticed that the Turks had an ability to give people immunity to smallpox. And when she had this done on her son, it seemed to work. She brought the idea all the way back to England. Well, what you do is this. You get somebody who has the pox. And of course, you have the pock marks on you. And there's going to be pus involved. There's going to be pus. And you just take some of the pus and you scratch somebody's arm, usually the arm, sometimes the leg. You scratch them and you take some of the pus. Sometimes they would do this with a thread. They get the thread on the pus, got a scratch in this person, and then you take the thread and you kind of work the pus into the scratch mark. In doing that, you give them a mild form of the disease. If your death rate's in having smallpox like 10 to 30%, you use this, you do get a mild form of the disease. You don't usually get pox all over you. It's usually a few of them around the place where you actually infected yourself. But this gives you immunity. Sometimes it doesn't last indefinitely. Sometimes it's literally for a period of years. And sometimes it's necessary to try to inoculation again. However, you can get this severe enough, it can kill you. But the percentage of death are very, very low. Rather than running the risk of 10% or more of dying, and getting this, you're running the risk of a few percent. Now, this is well before they started using cowpox. That's at the end of the century, the end of the 1700s, the end of the 18th century. So early in the 18th century, however, we do have a means by which we can at least prevent or keep smallpox from spreading as much. By the time you get to the American Revolution, George Washington's got these people coming in the army. He says, smallpox is going to take us down. So he'd have everybody inoculated. George Washington, as a young man, got a mild version of smallpox. So he was immune for life. His wife, Martha Washington, had not had it. Took a lot of guts for that lady to have inoculation. So it would not infect her. When you get to Jenner and using cowpox, when I was in the first grade, what, you're 6 years old? We all had to be inoculated. Oh, that was terrifying. Took us down to the first floor of the school. And they had the office down there. My last name starts with W, so I'm in the back of my class. Unfortunately, my class was the back of all the other classes. So I'm virtually at the end of the line. The line went way down the hall, went out into the playground. It seemed like a long time because I'm waiting for this terror to happen. And I went in and they scratched. Well, I wasn't looking, didn't have the guts. So in any event, I had a scab right here. The resolution on the screen is probably not good enough, but I could roll up my sleeve. It's right here. You probably can't see it. It's my inoculation right there. There was a scab there. I remember it bugged me. And after the scab fell off, apparently I was immune. When I was 19, remember that's first grade, I was 19, I was given a booster shot. This was gross because the lady, the nurse, put this substance, I guess it was cowpox, on me right here. And she took a piece of glass and broke off the end, so it was very sharp, and she stuck it in there. And it didn't take. I didn't get another scab. Since smallpox no longer exists, it's no longer necessary to inoculate people. Remember, they eradicated it in the 1970s. I'm okay with this. I wear shirts. Nobody sees this. What was really bad was for the women, because women like to wear short sleeve dresses. And a lot of times they had an appendectomy scar. What are you going to do about that? Sometimes when they had girls, they wouldn't give them the shot like they did me down here. They give the shot up here near the shoulder. So the scar would not be as visible down here, so you still have something that exposed something of your arm without showing the scar. Now, as young people, you don't have this anymore because it's gone. Okay, epidemics moderate. We do say wars moderate. Wars are pretty awful and there's a lot of devastation. When we get into Napoleon, we will talk about devastation once again. But in the 18th century, our wars less severe. We have major wars. Remember, I said the War of Spanish Succession was one of the great wars, but it ends in 1713. The other major wars in Europe, the War of Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748. Once again, Germany is hit very badly. But this doesn't really influence places like England or places like France. The other major war is the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. Once again, we fight it in Germany. A lot of devastation there. But we don't fight it in France. We don't fight it in Spain. England really doesn't have to worry about this at all, as far as invasions are concerned. Yeah, they fight in the war, but not in England. We say these are less wars. If you're using your point of departure, the 30 Years' War, which was 1648, I said that wrong, 1618 to 1648, yeah, the wars are less severe. And even though I mentioned several major wars, there's not an awful lot of them either. So wars moderate, we can make that statement. What does this mean for population? Remember I said that we go from high birth rates, high death rates. Then you get to low death rates, still high birth rates. So here's your population boom. This is your population explosion. Now, in the modern world, this is what's happened. The birth rates have gone down quite dramatically down here. The death rates still remain low. In some areas like Germany and Switzerland, the birth rate is so low that the death rates are there's actually a population decline going on. They were not allowing guest workers to come in. They'd have a hard time actually hiring enough people to run some of their businesses. That's the modern world. In the meantime, from the high death rates, you do have a big population growth. It is quite frankly huge. We say in Europe, this is too early for actual censuses, but we do have good reason to believe around 1750, there's about 140 million people in Europe. A century later, we have about 260 million people in Europe. That's not quite doubling, but that's a very, very big increase in population. So the states are getting very, very big at this time frame. Well, let's take a look at something else that's somewhat similar to the Industrial Revolution. To the Agricultural Revolution. Let's take a look at the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is enormously influential in many respects. It changes the political reality of many places in Europe and the world. You have second-rate powers and third-rate powers that, because of industrialization, become first-rate powers. Big political change. There's a change in productivity, in national wealth. There is a change in how we basically live our lives. Can we say Industrial Revolution causes the most fundamental change in how people live since the Neolithic? Those of you who've already had ancient civilizations probably know quite a bit about the Neolithic. The Neolithic, actually, when you go from hunters and gatherers going out and grabbing things to agriculture, we have a sedentary life where you sit around your crops. That is a large fundamental change in how people lead their lives. That's enormously important. Well, Industrial Revolution is also extremely important. Can we say almost everything we have is from industrialization? Could you imagine if you had to weave or manufacture your cloth, your clothing by hand and everything you had? You realize how expensive that would be? I mean, I don't have one shirt. I don't have one pair of trousers. That's all you could have possibly afford. Now they'd be made of wool. Wool kind of wears like iron. Probably last a long time. But you're not going to have extra clothing because you can't afford it. If you look around at our lives, my tie, my shirt, my bedspread, the walls, to a certain extent, even the air that I breathe. In the wintertime, of course, we have heating. Keeps the air warm, which is very nice. It makes it much more comfortable. Well, that becomes of industrialization because people have invented machinery to warm the house. In the summertime, I have air conditioning, and that comes from industrialization because people have invented the machinery to cool my house. Virtually, even including the air we breathe, even though we have to walk outside, the air is free. But anytime air is manipulated for my comfort, that's industrialization. The water I drink in the faucet, well, say I can go out in the stream and get water. Yes, I can. But the fact that it comes into my house through the pipes and pump systems that comes in, I can walk up to my faucet and take a drink of water. Almost everything we have, almost including the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, comes to us from industrialization. The food we eat, the car that I drive, the house that I live in, almost everything comes to us from a manufacturing process which was invented due to industrialization. You can see that this has had an enormous fundamental change in how people lead their lives. So almost everything we have is from industrialization, yes. Britain leads out. Say, well, why would Britain lead? Several factors. Peace. Now, I already mentioned the War of Spanish Succession. England is involved. I've already mentioned the War of Austrian Succession. England is involved. I've already mentioned the 7 Years' War. England's involved. Their navies send troops to other areas, including North America, where we beat the French in Canada, including India, where they beat the French in India. You're not fighting on British soil. Yeah, you fight in Germany. Yeah, you fight on the borders of other countries. So can we say peace is a big factor? Yes, we can. The banking system. The British have an advanced banking system. They're very good at it. You have good credit. If you have good credit, you can go and get loans. And loans allow you to have the financial capability to invest in new products, invest in machinery. Enclosure, I already mentioned enclosure when we were talking about agriculture. Enclosure for a labor force. Yeah, all these people that were kicked off the land are looking for employment. They'll do hard work, probably for less money in usual cases. So you take this labor force and now it's available. You can hire them. Free society. When I was talking about the Peasants' War in Germany, I kind of left it at that. The peasants did badly because they got defeated, and the peasants' revolt actually ends up in them being more repressed than they had been before. In the areas where this had happened, it usually takes another century or two. In fact, a lot of the peasants in Germany aren't really freed until the 18th century, until the 1700s. But Britain has had a free society going back earlier. We can say that after the after the 1500s to 16th century, England is more and more free. Free society where you have fewer serfs is very, very valuable. You see, someone like a slave, going back to something like ancient Rome, or a serf, are not going to be very innovative or productive because they will not benefit. If I'm a serf and I owe feudal dues money to the landlord, if I'm a serf and I'm tied to the land, and I'm a serf I have to even pay to grind my grain or go across a bridge or even bury a member of my family, and improve my lot or have a big invention, quite frankly, since I owe service to the landlord, he's going to benefit more than I am. We say it's a lack of incentive. But if you have a free society, that's extremely helpful, because in a free society, You have the opportunity now, if I make something I can personally benefit. Let's go back to the access of water. If you look at England, let's look at the island of Britain. Okay, images. I would like a map of Britain which actually shows you waterways. Fake Britain, I don't know what that's all about. Well, this is a tour. In fact, my one son and I did this. We got on a bus tour. We went up here, across to Ireland, came back like this. This was really a lot of fun. Now, that's a tour map. That's not really what I want. I'm going to try Britain Rivers, and I'm going to give it up. Okay. I want a map of the rivers. Oh, that's quite nice, actually. Notice there's a lot of rivers there. Britain is not like Utah, for example, with mountains all over the place. We have a few rivers, which are really creeks. We call them rivers because well, it's all we got, right? Britain is relatively flat. Does not have so much problem with falling water, with water flowing. So if you get a boat or a barge, whatever, on a number of rivers here, they're relatively slowly flowing, so it's relatively easy to move. It is realized by Britain, they don't start building canals. This has gone on in France even a century or two earlier. But the idea of canals has been around for a while, and the British realized that if we dig canals that connect rivers, for example, one waterway to another way, it's expensive to dig a canal, but there's no maintenance on water. It's not like a road that you're going to get ruts in it. There's no such thing as a rut in water. Yeah, you might have to pull out a few weeds and that kind of thing. But water is also virtually without friction. If you take a barge and you put it on water and you get it moving, a horse, a donkey, an ox, you can pull that along virtually with the strength of one animal. And you can have a number of tons involved here. This makes water transportation, it's not fast, but it makes it very, very cheap. If you're using water transportation, you can actually move much faster. Not faster, I keep saying that. You can move much more cheaply, goods and services, than you could ever by going across a road. So canals, water transportation, is very helpful in the industrialization of Britain. We do talk about brilliant men. I've mentioned Isaac Newton. I've mentioned Francis Bacon. They are very good in theoretical ideologies, theoretical ideas. The people are actually making the advances in industrialization are practical men. Mechanics, carpenters, brick masons. My dad was a mechanic. He didn't talk much, he said very little. But when he talked, he often had a lot of wisdom. He turned to me once, long time ago, said, "Do you know why we have so many advances?" I said, "No." He says, "Because people are lazy." I'm going to add this because sometimes people make advances because what way they did it before hurts their back. But if you're working, you're doing hard manual labor, and you're a free person, you say, if I can figure out a way of doing this better, I don't have to work as hard, and I also can get more return on what I'm doing, and doesn't hurt me as much. The first area where we actually find industrialization is in thread, cotton thread, the invention of the spinning jenny. How do you weave before this time frame? By hand. You get your loom up. Can I show you a weaving loom? I probably get a modern one, but might give you the same basic idea. Yeah, these are some old kind of looms. You simply set up your thread going, in this case, up and down. This is usually the case. And then you weave other thread, other yarn, back and forth through this. Could you imagine doing this? You got to set it up. That would be challenging. And doing this by hand, moving it back and forth. It's tedious, no doubt about that at all. Apparently, this young lady used this as a hobby. I'm sure it's a lot of fun. Okay. I'm sure it's a lot of fun. But if you want to produce a lot of material very rapidly, it might be better if you had something to help you do this faster. What you do, what had been done before this time frame, and sometimes we call the maiden woman who lives with your family the spinster, because she's over there spinning yarn by hand. So essentially what you have is a spindle, and you put the thread on it, and the young woman very often would spin this, and that would weave yarn. When you actually have a spinning wheel, the most famous spinning wheel we see in literature was it Sleeping Beauty? Don't quote me on that one. Who touched the spinning wheel and went to sleep? Well, if you simply have a mechanism by which you can actually make the cloth, make the yarn yourself. And the spinning jenny, let's get a spinning jenny for you here. And you get a spinning jenny, which actually means by turning a crank, you can actually, rather than having one spindle to make yarn, you can actually have multiple spindles at one time. And after a while, they realize that you don't have to have people turning the crank anymore. You have a water frame, you have falling water, and the water goes in and turns the crank and creates large numbers of thread a lot faster. Before I get into this, let me point out what we mean by Jenny. I don't know the name of the wife or the girlfriend of the man who invented this. It could have been Jenny. Maybe it wasn't Jenny. What Jenny is actually short for is engine. So this is the spinning engine. In American history, we have an invention called the cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney. It's a mechanism, it's a device to remove seeds from cotton, from raw cotton. So you can actually have combed cotton, which you can use now to weave into yarn and into cloth. Now, I don't know the favorite drink of the inventor here. At that time frame, Americans did have a tendency to drink whiskey, however, maybe like gin. But the cotton gin is not named after a drink. It's also short for engine. Spinning jenny, spinning engine. Cotton gin, spinning engine. Excuse me, said that wrong. Cotton gin, cotton engine. Now, something else we have right here is cheap iron. Once again, geography is going to play a role in this, and you do see a lot more of productivity of iron in Britain than other countries. In order to make iron, you actually need about 10 times by weight as much coal as you need iron ore. So it's much easier to transport iron ore to coal than coal to iron ore. And England has coal. Initially, back in the Middle Ages, started mining the coal. It was fairly close to the surface. But after a while, you go down in. You get the iron ore, you get the coal, and then you use the coal to heat. I know there's a process involved. You usually get coal and you make coke out of it. Coke is hotter, burns hotter than coal. And then so you have a much hotter means by which you can melt the iron ore get the slag out, and use the iron for what you want. The British become so efficient at this that they actually start producing some very cheap iron. Iron becomes so cheap you can use it for a lot of things. While traditionally the British had been making bridges out of wood, wood rots and doesn't last very long, or stone. The trouble with stone is it's heavy, sometimes a lot of maintenance on it. But it takes longer to build a bridge out of stone. Cheap iron, they start building bridges out of iron. And even though we're talking a couple hundred years ago now, even more than that, some of these bridges still exist. They were built very early on. Iron becomes so cheap, you start making bedposts out of iron. People start using decorative arts. It might be expensive to get a small figure, a figurine made out of porcelain, but you can get a figurine made out of iron and use decoration. The only trouble with iron is it tends to be dark. It's kind of a black substance. That's not as pretty as other kinds of pottery, but you can use this in many, many ways. Cheap iron, even today, is really important as far as industry is concerned. Later, when you get trains, and you get train tracks made out of iron, later when you get steam engines made out of iron, you see that has many uses. It has many uses, it will do many things for you, and it's really quite cheap. Now, I haven't checked on the price of iron in the United States recently, but back when I was taking some geography classes, it was like 7 cents a pound. So this can be extremely valuable and helpful. And I got into this a little bit too much. I've actually run over a little bit. You do have my apology for that. However, we are right here in our discussion. Next time we'll start talking about other forms of machinery, including the steam engine, which helps industrialization. In the meantime, enjoy the benefits of industrialization, and I hope you're having a great time in your air-conditioned house. I'll talk to you next time.